So I wanted to just give a quick overview of the setup that I have here for growing, in this case, mustard greens, and I have some different types of lettuce. So the first thing is this table. This table is just made from some white pine that I had left over from building my canoe. There's some epoxy left over on it, but the point is that it can handle quite a bit of weight. This is full of water, and in order to make this waterproof, this is just some pond liner. So you can buy this. This is for like an outdoor pond. It's pretty heavy duty. You can't just use plastic, like 5 or 10 mil plastic. It's not tough enough. Any little tiny leak will be eventually you lose all your water through. So you want to make sure that you use something heavy duty like this. The platform here that sits on top of the water is styrofoam. This is just foam board. You can see that I put the reflective surface up. That's important. Keeps the light reflecting back towards the plants. Ideally, I might even put foil around the edges here, around the sides. I noticed temperature has become a little bit of a factor down here. It's gotten kind of cool, and it seems like that would also be a good idea to keep some of the heat in from the lamp. The lamp is just a 4-bulb fluorescent. It's about 4 feet long. You can see it's a little shorter than the table, and of course a little bit narrower, but the light obviously spreads out, so this is plenty for me. I keep it on probably something like 18 hours a day, maybe 16 hours a day, and I just have it on a timer. What's important is that it's on these chains, so I can lift it up and lower it, and kind of keep up with the level of the plants as it changes. So I'll show you kind of how these plants get planted and how they get put into the table here. So these were a couple of blocks that were left over from the last time I germinated the plants that are growing now. Usually what I'll do is I'll take the seeds. You can see there's a couple of coriander seeds here. I'll put them into this paper towel. I'll keep it a little bit moist, and I'll put that in a warm area. Those seeds will crack open in just a day or two if it's warm enough. And what I'll do once they crack open is I'll drop them in with tweezers, because some of the seeds, especially for lettuce, are super, super small. And I'll just stick them down about 1/4 of an inch down into the substrate once it's saturated with water. So I'll saturate this with water. This substrate here, this for growing, is just it's a Rockwool. It's like a mineral product. Here it is actually. Here's the kind that I have. I thought about using just normal Rockwool insulation, but I think it has flame retardant on it, so you probably don't want to use that. Once that is in here, it will actually start to sprout up, and I'll usually cover this in a plastic, there's a plastic top to this, so that the moisture stays in and the heat stays in, and the sunlight can come in. I'll usually start this upstairs in the actual sunlight. I don't use a grow light for this usually. Once it gets tall enough so it's hitting the top of the container, so a couple of inches tall, I'll take this substrate and I'll take each one of them off and put them into their baskets. The baskets look like this, so the basket will just go into there, or the substrate will go into the basket like that. And usually I try to make sure that there's some rocks, so I'll take some of these stones, these pebbles, and place them around there just so that this thing is kind of stabilized in here until the roots can start to take hold. After that, I'll take the basket and move it over to the table. Here's one that we were away, so it got dried out and it never really fully started. But here's a basket that was put in. And usually it's a good idea to make sure that your water level is right up to the very bottom of this basket. So just barely touching, maybe, like a 1/4 inch at max above, or probably, but just barely touching the bottom of that basket is what you want. So that's kind of important to set the level of water in here before you start, so that when you put these baskets in, and you can kind of test it by taking all the stuff out of the basket and putting an empty basket in there and making sure it touches the water. As the plants start to grow, they drink up the water and the water level lowers. So the roots can start to, they won't completely be submerged the entire time. And you can see this has been growing for a while, so many of the roots are quite exposed to the air, but obviously a lot of them are still in the water down at the bottom. So that's a really essential part of this. You don't want to have to build aeration systems and all of that. This is a nice method because it's very passive. It doesn't require pumps and filtration. But after a few months, you have to change out the water, and you can see that it's getting a little bit tired. Some of these plants are discoloring a little bit because that water has been sitting there for a few months now. So here's a view from the other side. And just kind of to review, really the important thing is to build the table, make sure it's super sturdy, really heavy-duty platform. It also have to have a lot of support on the bottom, very solid. I put actually a couple of extra supports just running across here because I wasn't sure if it was going to be enough. The waterproofing membrane, I staple that in here. The foam board, ideally with some kind of reflective surface. If it's just white, I'm sure it's fine. I just happen to have a reflective surface on mine. I made sure that this thickness was such that I could put a basket in here and the bottom would be sticking out. So that's one kind of critical thing, because that bottom of that basket should be just barely at the water level. And the light, which is obviously a big part of this. These plants have plenty of light. With this one, it does, use certainly some energy, but it's really nice to have these plants growing down here. I can run down and just grab what I need for dinner, if I have leftovers, it's fine because they grow more for next time. One final step, one important kind of extra ingredient here is the water, and the water needs to be fertilized with this stuff. So there's a bunch of different things in here. I'll have a little bit more of a description about them and how much you add. There are a couple of ways to manage it. Essentially, what I was doing for a while was I'd mix up 5-gallon buckets at a time and then put the right amount of fertilizer in each 5-gallon bucket, dump it in, and then do another one. This is about 20 or 25 gallons, believe it or not, in this table. So that's actually quite a bit. So it would take about 4 or 5 buckets to fill this entire table with water. So depending on how much water you have, it can vary, but it is a good idea to mix it up in 5-gallon buckets first, especially if you're just starting off. The second time I did it, I mixed everything all together because I kind of knew the volume and I calculated it out. But it is kind of useful to mix it up in batches before you dump it in. You can actually see one of the interesting things is that there are ladybugs here, and so this is actually kind of cool because this is supposed to be an environment where there's really no insects. Ladybugs are actually the only insect that I've ever seen down here, but they're probably the best insect to have around the plants, because one of the things that you do combat is aphids, and these guys love to eat aphids. So interestingly, the only insect that I have down here is the kind that I want. I haven't had any issues with insects or aphids or little bugs on the plants. And really the kind of important thing is that wherever you do this, you want it to be somewhat isolated from that environment, because if you do have bugs, right, there's no pesticides on this or anything, or you don't want to have to spray it with anything. So you can really have out of control situations if you get bugs down here. Eliminating the soil is a really big part of that solution, right? So without the soil, that's where a lot of the bugs and larvae for different types of pests that you could have come from. Without that soil, you don't have nearly as much of a risk for that kind of thing. So I've never had any problems with that, and you can see these plants are doing really quite well. One of the big things that has changed the second time around is the temperature. It's probably 10 or 15 degrees cooler down here than it was the first time I grew these plants. And so they started off growing much more slowly than the first time. I've noticed that as the days, we're getting close to March here, and the days are starting to get quite a bit longer, and there's a little bit more, definitely the ground is frozen still, but the house, I think, is heating a little bit more. Another thing is the room above us right now was closed off for a while, so it was quite cold up there, and now it's warming up. So the growth seems to have really started to take off once again. So I've got to get eating here because I have lots of mustard greens to eat.